All right, before I tell you all a few stories, I want you to picture what community means to you. Maybe friends or family come to mind. Perhaps even a professor who has challenged you to look at new ideas with a new perspective. Or a musician who writes music that you really resonate with. Maybe even draw the circle wider. Think about the farmers who grow your food. Perhaps the construction workers who build the buildings that you live in and that we're in today. The sound and light folks who make sure that we're able to have this event. All of these people are part of your community. But community isn't just restricted to our human experience. It stretches out into the rest of the biosphere, where hundreds of thousands of other species work to ensure our survival, but also allow us to live our day-to-day lives. And each one benefits our lives on an intimate basis, directly or indirectly. One of these species is the eastern hemlock tree. The eastern hemlock tree was studied in a 2017 report by the Ecological Research Institute in the Catskills of New York. And eastern hemlock trees grow in the Northwoods, but they also grow down the Appalachian Mountains, and they grow over headwater streams. All right, here's our eastern hemlock tree. And eastern hemlocks grow over these headwater streams, and each of their needles are interlocked together so closely that it forms a blanket over the canopy. And this blanket covers the water and the soil and enables species like trout and salamanders and wildflowers to thrive. But the hemlocks cool the water that doesn't just stay under the hemlocks. That water trickles down into larger streams. And those streams pour into larger bodies of water like the Mississippi and the Hudson River. And all that water ultimately reaches the ocean. Hemlocks have been endangered by many human activities, anthropogenic harms or human-caused harms, like exotic pests and predominantly logging, indiscriminate taking of this timber. And when hemlocks are cut and destroyed, the water changes. The water chemistry changes. It begins to heat up and evaporate. And this water that flows in the Mississippi and the Hudson and into the ocean not only affects the people who live around the hemlock trees, but everyone on a global scale. They have a globally small range, but their place in the world is important. All right. So our next species is much smaller, and it's the squash bee. And squash bees are not like our familiar honeybees. Honeybees live in colonies and have queens. Squash bees are alone. The male dies soon after mating, and the female is tasked with raising a tiny ground nest as a single mother. Squash bees have watched the domestication of most of the plants we grow in the squash family. These are cucumbers, zucchini, gourds, pumpkins, summer squash. All of these plants, squash bees have influenced. Their entire life has been correlated with our squash plants. But squash bees will fly from squash flower to squash flower and sleep in the squash flowers, and they get covered in the pollen. And as soon as the squash flower opens each morning, the bee flies out to the next flowers. And then by the time of the next nightfall, the bee sleeps in the next flower. Squash bees are competing with honeybees. Honeybees are an introduced species that humans farm in hives and in colonies, just as we all know. But honeybees are really bad at pollinating squash. They do a pretty horrible job. When they fly from squash flower to squash flower, they show up 3 or 4 hours too late, and they end up flying into the flowers. A study by Vincent Tepedino in 1981 showed that these squash bees are much more efficient. They've lived alongside the squash as long as squash has been around, and pumpkins and cucumbers and zucchini. All these plants depend on the squash bee to survive. That's pretty important, because squash bees can't be farmed, at least today. They rely on the forgotten paths, dodging the plow, of red clay mud in the fields. Honeybees are pampered in hives, but squash bees only survive by a so-called coincidence. Another integral species to our life today is the Neotropical Warblers. It's actually a group of species. This one's the Blackburnian warbler, and it's particularly good at their job. They don't have a job per se, but they perform some pretty important roles. And one of these roles is very important to us humans. Neotropical warblers winter in Central and South America, and they must fly in a single nocturnal flight across the Gulf of Mexico. And they fight their way through the United States through the spring, and by summer, they end up in the boreal forests of Canada. And these tiny, colorful birds must build a nest deep within the spruce forest. And those birds feed on one main source. A 1989 study by Crawford and Jennings in the Journal of Ecology found that these birds eat spruce budworms at an enormous scale. And spruce budworms are little chubby brown caterpillars. They're very nutritious for young birds. So these warblers continuously feed their babies thousands and thousands of these caterpillars each day. That constant trips, just trying to find enough caterpillars to keep their babies alive. And as they capture these spruce budworms, they're alleviating the stress of the spruce budworms on the tree. Spruce budworms are known as horrible pests in the spruce timber industry. If you notice on many guitars, that have a light, soft wood for a soundboard, that wood is usually made of spruce wood. And that spruce is frequently harvested in the boreal forests of Canada. So, these spruce plantations that are grown for timber production, to produce the spruce that we appreciate in guitars and furniture, those plantations are all spruce trees. There's no variation of habitat, which makes it very hard for the warblers to survive. So spruce budworms take over. They don't have anything eating them. So the spruce budworms begin to defoliate these trees. And as a result, the spruce trees begin to die off. There aren't bogs or marshes interspersed that enable the warblers to find good places to nest, good places to hunt, good places to escape predators. The plantations are eaten by spruce budworms. Now, humans like to figure out good ways to control things, right? There are chemical controls like pesticides that have been used in those forests, but they're not effective because when they're effective, but they're really good at doing their job, it's killing. And they kill the spruce budworms, but they kill other insects and fungi that the spruce trees need to grow. They need the warblers. The spruce budworms need the warblers. The spruce trees need the warblers. It's an interconnected, an interwoven chain of the warblers, the spruce budworms, and the spruce trees. Another important example is bog peat moss, and moss in general, because in her 2013 book, Robin Wall Kimmerer dissected the human usage of mosses. These mosses are really important because they grow in these vast areas called peat lands. And mosses are non-vascular plants. And unlike trees and wildflowers, non-vascular plants don't have a complex vein system. They can pull carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and release oxygen gas at a very rapid rate. They don't have to it doesn't have to travel all the way through the tree. It can be put out back into the atmosphere as oxygen, breathable oxygen. We require non-vascular plants to survive. They produce the majority of oxygen on Earth. Whether it's peat moss or forest mosses or cyanobacteria in the ocean, we require plants and semi-plants that aren't part of what we normally think of as plants. These tiny overlooked species are producing most of the oxygen we breathe and that other species breathe. But it goes further than that. In today's threat of global climate change, these mosses sequester that carbon dioxide that they exchange into oxygen, and they put it in the ground. They turn that carbon back into organic carbon in the soil that can be used by other species and becomes a vast biological reserve of nutrients. So they're able to continue that cycle. All of these species, in fact, all the species you've seen today are found within 200 miles of where we are today. And I've witnessed them personally. These species are vital to our survival. Each one provides some kind of benefit to our lives. You might not quite recognize them, or you might recognize them like old friends. But each of them is extremely important to our lives. In your life, these species have a role. We're vibrantly interconnected with them. Even if you don't live locally, you'll have your own set of species like these that live in your environment, but like the hemlock tree, each of these is also tied to your life. All of these species are connected, and we're connected with them. And we can be mindful in that about how we contribute to society on a local scale, but also on a global scale by how we contribute. And today, I challenge you to go out in your own lives and think about how you can consider your non-human neighbors in the things you do. Thank you.